Welcome to another show, and we have a fantastic guest today. Today's conversation is going to examine what is happening with the investment climate in the space industry since the SpaceX IPO. We'll also look at how the digital infrastructure may redefine how space assets are supported and funded. Welcome to the Tech and Space Leader Show, where we learn lessons from leaders of the next frontier. I am your host, Lisa Dreher, and I'm really excited to introduce our guest for today, Grant Blaisdell. He is the co-founder and CEO of Copernic Space. Welcome to the show, Grant.
Thanks for having me, Lisa. Appreciate it a lot and look forward to it.
Absolutely. Perhaps we can start by having you give just a little background on yourself and Copernic Space.
Sure. So, myself, I've been in the startup ecosystem since my late teens. Originally from Los Angeles, so I was focused on digital media platforms and marketplaces. Did some work with the major studios with what became Hulu eventually. At the same time, I started my first startup, which was one of the first startups focused on distributing video on cell phones. This is before the iPhone was out. We were programming on Palm. So big lessons there around timing and things like that. That eventually got me into the blockchain technology market because I viewed it as a solution and new economic infrastructure for digital media and music. We can look at digital media and music as some form of digital assets. And that was over 12 years ago, so I've been in that market for a very long time and have created a few ventures in that. Most notably, before Copernic Space, I co-founded CoinFirm, which was really a category creator and a leader in the advanced analytics and specifically anti-money laundering for digital assets. So I've worked with anyone from banks and regulators to the exchanges, all the way down to the protocols and the application layers. That got acquired a few years ago by a large American company, but I'm third generation space. My grandpa built the original space program in Poland, which is where I am at the moment. So he was responsible for it being the fourth country to shoot up an astronaut. That astronaut actually was originally his student in the Air Force before they did that together. And he has the earliest works I know of around this concept of democratizing access to space. So those are the roots, the values that sit behind Copernic Space. Copernic Space itself was really birthed by Vandenberg, what was then Air Force Base, now Space Force Base, um, because my co-founder and I were some of the earliest kind of participants, people on the ground in this new space economy when it was in its infancy. And we realized, based off our backgrounds and more, that really the largest need and opportunity that's going to emerge, as with any sort of frontier, new or major market, is the financial infrastructure and the market for it, not just the physical infrastructure or the software and the services servicing that physical infrastructure. So we realize that space very soon is going to enter a moment where it needs to be transformed into a market and a related asset class. And we believe that it's one of the largest and most important opportunities of this century, and will not only unlock and empower the great entrepreneurs, the technologies, the solutions being built by those entrepreneurs and ventures, but it's very important to enable as many entities and individuals to become participants and stakeholders in it, whether that's from an investment end or from a commercial access ownership utility sort of end. I'm wondering if you're still there. It seems you've gone offline. Let's see.
Oh my goodness. Oh, well, we
You're
were
back.
back. Okay. Oh, holy moly. Wow. Okay. Well, we'll just cut that bit out. So sorry, gang, for
Well,
losing
my
things
part
there.
got recorded. My part got recorded because I'm watching the stream separately on a mobile device. So my part
Oh,
continued. So you were out for a bit. So
oh,
I just kind of kept going and finished my side of things the best I could. So
okay.
uh, I
Well,
kind of went through it. So I'm happy to expand on that a little bit more. Eventually, I chose to stop to see if it came back or worked. So no worries. I don't think we have to cut it out. It's kind of authentic in a way.
okay. Well, I don't know what's going on. Must be on my end then. So sorry, gang.
That's okay.
Okay. So let's actually jump into things and talk a little bit about the SpaceX IPO and how this has shifted investor behavior.
Yeah, I think, as someone who's been very early in the economic, the financial, the commercial focus side of space, it was for the most part, other than a few specialized VCs and individuals, um, it was treated with a lot of hesitancy or disbelief, even sometimes, and sometimes rightfully so, um, because space hadn't really proven itself to be this great ROI sort of market yet, as you hadn't really had any big exits, shown that capability for investor liquidity. Obviously, SpaceX is the linchpin of kind of proving it, which has had its negatives as well because people then start viewing space almost exclusively through like Musk and maybe Bezos, and if you know a little bit more, Rocket Lab. So there wasn't a realization that there's thousands of companies that are emerging, and I think we can take the blame ourselves in the space market that we haven't properly communicated the value that space in reality has been creating for decades, but that a lot of the most important technology, scientific innovations, and that will have major or have major effect on Earth originate out of space. So I think there's some of it is an issue of communicating from the space market. The other has been, it's hard for these investors to just take this big leap of faith because generally investing in space is expensive, it's very specialized, it's concentrated risk, and then your liquidity event timeline is what, 10 years? Who knows, right?
Yeah.
So the SpaceX IPO was, other than that it's, the biggest IPO ever, et cetera, was that big proving point of like, hey, if you're in early stage, if you take that risk in early stage, because that's really where the big gap is for space, is more in the early stage. If you take these early stage risks, that payoff can come and that payoff can be extremely lucrative, right?
Hmm.
So what we've seen, from our angle, and you've seen it in the activity that's publicly published, right? Whether it's news or LinkedIn or whatever it is that there's just loads of more capital that's kind of looking at space.
Hmm.
And we've seen that just talking to different angles of the liquidity market, whether it's VCs or more kind of private debt lending, high net worth individuals, is that now they're much more open to get into space. It's not so abstract anymore.
Yeah, yeah. Where do you see, like, what types of companies do you see the investment coming in for in terms of the types of space companies? And then also, do you see more scrutiny on the investments that are being made in these companies?
I think if hype builds and grows, and you have a few of these big successful use cases, the scrutiny kind of lowers, right? Space is still very kind of engineering sort of minded, right? And that kind of shows how the investments are going. But I think, if you're able to catch certain waves, which is a timing thing, it's a skill of communication, it's your network, as a startup. I think, the AI, the AI data center thing is like an example of that. Like, a few big guys started talking about it. A few companies, have been a part of that wave, and at least one of them is now, I believe, multi-billion dollars in valuation, right? So that's a cool sign because it shows what an issue I think is like, how many rocket companies do we want to fund, right? How much do we want to continue investing in kind of the same heavy infrastructure verticals, as opposed to, some newer ones, or, the pickaxes, the shovels businesses of space, right? So it's like the same thing with us at Copernic Space. We don't build rockets, we don't launch rockets, we don't build satellites, we don't generate the data, for the satellites. We're not software servicing the satellites or propulsion or anything like that. We're providing a financial and marketplace layer that empowers those companies and the entire space economy as a whole, to scale and have more velocity and be more liquid and accessible.
Right. So what types of companies are you looking at right now?
As far as like us as a company,
Mm-hmm.
well, we don't act as a fund ourselves. So, the way that we act is a platform that onboards the infrastructure and the assets. One of the big revolutions we're doing is we're taking space from investment in space being exclusively pretty much focused on equity in a space company, which again, it's like centralized risk, big tickets, long liquidity event timelines, and doing what every major frontier kind of market eventually goes through as it matures, which we're structuring the infrastructure and what we call the real world space asset layers. So instead of you investing into equity of a rocket company, you can invest into the rocket itself that they're launching and reap benefits off the commercial revenue that rocket is generating over its lifeline. So although, eventually we will be hosting, company equity and providing a more liquid secondary market for it than exists, I believe the real revolution is bringing it into a much more fractionalized access level, that focuses on the infrastructure and the assets themselves. So we've actually segregated this market into two asset classes. One we call financial space assets. So that's that investment into the rocket, satellite, data center, compute capacity, right? You can even bust it down on the payload sort of levels. And then what we call real world space asset, which are those actual assets that have commercial value, ownership, utility sort of attached to them. And it becomes this cycle that feeds itself, right? The commercialization feeds the investment.
Right. Okay. So, oh my goodness. We're just having a day, aren't we?
It's all right. Usually it's on my end. Usually I'm worried my internet's going to.
Okay. It looks
I'm glad
like
it's not me this time and it's on you.
I'm still here. This
You're,
is
you're still here.
awesome.
I hear you. I hear you. Keep talking to me.
Fun
And,
day for
yeah. Oh, and she's gone. All right, I'm going to go through the questions I see potentially in here while we're doing this, maybe. Let's fill some time. I've hosted a lot of events myself, so.
okay.
Okay, you're
There
back.
we go. Holy moly. Okay, so let's jump into this a little bit deeper. So, talk a little bit about how tokenization actually changes the way organizations can structure, distribute, monetize mission related assets.
Yeah, so for us, we're not selling the one thing I think like the crypto market has failed in, et cetera, is it's kind of selling, it's trying to sell what's a very technical or abstract concept to most people as like the value add. And for us, that's not the thing. It's the underlying, again, the infrastructure that powers all this stuff. So the most basic, if we're going to start at the most basic level, one of the things that we're answering, and the more you talk to me, you'll hear me use the word standards a lot, is we're helping create the standard for what even represents verified ownership of space assets. There's no like real standard. What represents ownership of an asset in space, and how do you create a standard for that? So that's one thing that we're answering with tokenization is you have the capability to have immutable, so to say, digital ownership of assets that we can't touch on Earth, etc. Right? So that's like one underlying thing is like creating an asset ownership, and with it a management system for all these assets. Right? The other layer of it comes into turning these assets into something that is programmable, right? Something that can chop it up into smaller pieces, and something that can provide a more accessible market and secondary market for them. Space is actually going to be the first major market and asset class ever that has the opportunity to be inherently on-chain on that sort of level. The big issue has been with tokenization, et cetera, is that you're trying to penetrate markets and asset classes with decades of legacy systems, standards, et cetera. And it's very hard to gut that in scale and completely change it. For a lot of the incumbents, it's not even in their really big interest to do it. But you're starting to see whether it's BlackRock, whether it's NASDAQ, whoever it is, they're going, oh, okay, there's massive benefits if we take that big swipe and do it to integrate these assets on this sort of infrastructure. Okay, so for us, like it can go so far as even security, which is, for example, I'm buying a license to access some sort of data being generated by this satellite. Okay, if I don't have ownership of that license in a tokenized format, in a very secure, let's say, wallet that's custodied, I can't access that data, period. Right? So you can go all the way from asset creation, ownership, management, to the commercialization, financialization, all the way to the security layer for that. And space assets are not, they're not like every other asset. That security layer can be very important for a certain amount of them. And that's why we're even, discussing having like quantum resistant sort of elements to these assets over the long term, because that's going to be a thing here in a future that I think is faster than most people understand. So again, we treat it as the economic infrastructure and the best technology to be the foundation for the space market and the space asset class.
So talk a little bit more about that. I understand that you're working on or already have quantum resistant blockchain layer. So talk a little bit more about that and how that came about.
That's just, that's us looking into the future a few years. One of our great strengths, which sometimes makes it harder, has been, seeing how the markets, like when we started Copernic Space, people looked at us a little crazy. Now people don't look at us as so crazy. So it's the same thing with the quantum element is that a lot of in the media, a lot has been put on like the crypto market is like when quantum starts becoming like really usable or et cetera, that they're just going to attack the crypto market. The honest truth is that if it can attack the crypto market, it's already penetrated your banking system and everything like that. For us, it's just an additional security layer for the viability and the long-term viability and ownership of these assets. And this is especially going to be, important once we get into these very sensitive assets where you have national security, government, ownership, et cetera. Because we inherently view what we're building over the next couple years as dual use, so to say. You can take the infrastructure and the standards we've built and extend that to build private platforms, markets for governments and major enterprises. So I'm not a quantum expert. I'm friends with some of the earliest VCs or investors that got into quantum. But it's not something that's not real. You know, everything's about timing when you want to invest or take something seriously. But it's important to be ready versus be too late when it comes to something like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So where are you in the like development process?
Uh, so, you know, we've been around since really 2021. Because we're pioneers in this, you have to focus on creating some standard, creating a use case around that standard, and proving that standard in the market to some level. You know, we weren't going to just come out and say, hey, we are this, and everything's just going to jump on board, because space especially is not like that. So what we focused on in the beginning was creating standards for certain different asset types, verticals. The first one we focused on is what we call the physical payload standard. So how do we take physical payload capacity, and our first case was with a rocket, but once you create a standard, you can apply it horizontally. How do we create a standard of turning that into a programmable asset, make it fractionalizable so that depending on the client, whatever it is, you can divvy out different size portions of it and show that you can commercialize a physical payload in this manner. So we did that with a European rocket company initially. We sold that out in 24 to 48 hours. So we had our initial platform, right, with this marketplace element to it, and that's what we proved it on. Then we wanted to take a bigger step and kind of knock out two birds with one stone. We foresaw that digital storage capacity, now that's molding into computation, is going to be even more scalable in a certain manner than we just saw that writing on the wall, that that's a logical next step for the industry. So we did what we call Moon Mission 1, and the two birds with one stone there was we didn't want to just say, hey, we can structure digital storage on a moon mission into an asset, fractionalize it, sell it to a broader B2B and even B2C base, but we want to prove a new financing model for that. And that was the first use case where we had Kevmar fund, so a fund come in, provide liquidity to acquire the capacity for a percentage of the commercial revenue that payload capacity will generate, right? And then we commercialized it and we provided them returns in about 5 months, right? So that's how you take space from being, you know, has to be massive tickets, many years liquidity event timelines, and busted down onto, you know, a more accessible, less risk, faster liquidity sort of market. So those are the two standards we've shown now. Now what we're looking to do is to scale those. So we did a pre-seed round before. We have a good group of early stage VCs and some strategic angels. So now we're entering into our seed round. Why? So we can scale the standards, launch the more advanced, what we call version 2 of the platform, which will host the first secondary market for ownership of real world space assets. So those 1,000 plus digital assets that are literally sitting on the lunar surface right now, to create a secondary market for people to trade the rights and ownership of them, right? So we're creating standards. It doesn't matter whether your payload or your asset is something highly technical or whatever it is, or it could be a piece of art. The standards should apply kind of ubiquitously around that. So now we have a big pipeline of anything from structuring reusable rockets into this, to working on a big asteroid mission, to doing some compute and space aspects. So we're just moving horizontally across the market. So eventually we create the standards that can apply to 90+% of the needs of the market.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, well, you have proven today that the show must go on, so awesome job on that part. If someone wanted to learn more about Copernic Space, what should they do?
Go to copernicspace.com. So you see my name right there. That's how you spell it. The biggest thing is one thing I think we do, you know, kind of uniquely for space companies, although space companies are getting a lot better at this, is just being out and available, and whether it's social media, we do, an X Space pretty much every week. You can hear from me directly kind of what we're doing. We bring on guests, partners, what we call our passport holders. So these are like community members and users that participate, and they're B2B, B2C people. As a platform, as a market, we're two-sided. There's the supply end, which is usually space companies, and then there's the demand end. So we've had people recently come to us talking about sending, authenticating, tokenizing all sorts of assets, whether it's brands wanting to do, transforming their products into real world space assets, which creates not only unique brand value, but, gives them some sort of commercial asset that's very unique. We've had Pokemon cards, platforms interested in stuff like that. To other space companies that are just looking into fractionalized access to space so that they don't have to launch a whole massive dedicated mission, buy out those minimum amounts of payload, but kind of access these fractionalized opportunities to send something to space. So, the cool thing about us is, we get to interact with every side of the market, almost every type of space company. It's just a matter whether it's something we can service right now, or it's something a little bit further down the road as we move, progress through these use cases and asset types.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for making time to be here today. And like I said, great job making the show go on. So we really look forward to watching as Copernic Space continues forward.
Thank you. I'm here for anyone as a resource, and of course, I want to thank you again, Lisa, for having me on, and treat me as a resource as well.
Absolutely. And I do want to take a moment to thank GuideForce for hosting these sessions. To learn more about GuideForce, you can visit guideforce.com. And we'll see you next time on the Tech and Space Leaders Show.